All right, let's talk mixing station again. I've done quite a few upgrades since the last video I did. The first upgrade I did was, out of paranoia, I put a huge carbon block on it. So now it goes through the first one, through the second one, then through the big one, and then lastly through this carbon stage here, which is a 0.5 micron one. The big one I think is 1 micron, but it's also one of those like chloramine busters. I don't actually have chloramines, but what if my water company decides to change something or do a flush? I don't know. I'm paranoid. I've got a lot invested in my systems. That's just another insurance policy for me. The other thing I did is I added a third flow meter. So there's now two flow meters that I think you can see from here. There's the one on the side for the inlet. On top of that, if you look below there, there's a shutoff solenoid now, because I ditched my old Aquatic Life booster pump, which was this square rectangle thing over here. I ditched that and I went to the traditional, I was at Aquatech, and so the Aquatech is in here. And can I turn the flash on? Maybe not. Oh, not in this mode here. There we go. So there's a whole bunch of stuff down here. I was playing around with this permeate pump. I don't know that I'm going to use it, but essentially there is a ton of flow meters down here. There's a flow meter, where is it? Off of the, it's right there. So that's off the waistline. And then there's also a flow meter off the product line, which I guess is, yeah, there it is on the floor. And I also added another booster gauge so that I can see the pressure of the product water. And that's because there's now a shit ton of pressure gauges and this and that. This is the line going into the RO booster pump, and it has a low pressure shutoff gauge. This is the line coming out feeding the RO membrane. Over here, you can see there's TDS meters everywhere. That's where the two RO membranes come back, and this is like an emergency pressure shutoff. That's a 60 psi shutoff gauge, and I probably have it set around 70, which is basically like 10 psi higher than I keep the booster tank for my kitchen. And then of course it branches off. Oh, here's another new thing. This is my auto flush valve that I made myself. So basically it's just two T's, or I guess Y's you would call them, a solenoid, and this is a 300 mil flow restrictor. I'm still running like an inverted waste ratio, and essentially the flow restrictor is just it's just that like transformer right there. So the apex now controls the flushing of the RO. When apex also controls the on and off of the booster pump. So the way that this kind of works is the RO tank has a double float valve, and it will fill from, and you can see there's 4 wires coming off of this. So it will fill from, there's 2 float valves, one's like here, one's like here, or switches, float switches, my bad. And so the bottom switch will get triggered, and it won't, and then the top switch will also go down, but it won't start filling to the top switch until the bottom switch is down. And then at that point it fills from, you know, wherever it is until it hits the top switch. And then there is a float valve as well as just a emergency backup. And so that's where that shut off switch comes in here. For some reason the floats got stuck or faulty or leaked or whatever, the pump would still shut off when it senses that float valve. And on top of that I actually put a pressure switch here as well, which tells the apex that the pressure is building up on this line. So I've actually got 2 emergency shut off switches just for this tank. That solenoid there is part of, it basically is what opens and closes the flow to this tank, because essentially now that I've set up dual pressure zones, it will prioritize filling the kitchen booster tank. On top of that, I've got leak sensors. That one there is part of the FMM. This one was the ALD, and I actually modified this because it was all rusted out. So I put in this new, it's a rain sensor actually, but I upgraded that one, or fixed it, I guess you could say. This one over here I made myself. I actually, it's just a piece of plastic that I cut out, and I glued like 3 circuit boards to the back of it just to add some weight, and I had some like raw copper PCBs that were from like when I was etching my own circuit boards a while ago. So I kind of glued them on there just because it was easy enough. I used some contact adhesive and some super glue, and so that's all good. Okay, so let's go over here to the booster tank. So the booster tank now has, as you can see, a pressure switch here, and that runs off and back over to the Apex over there. There's actually a dedicated Apex Junior that drives all this. That's that, I think I showed you where the outlets were plugged in. That was actually the Apex Junior. It looks like an EB4, but it's not. And essentially what this does is, and you can see the pressure on here is like just below 60. That's usually where it fills to. Once the pressure gets down to like right here or so, then it turns on the booster pump, but closes the solenoid that's in that back corner that I was showing you for the RO tank, or RODI tank. So it'll close that solenoid and then run the booster pump to pressurize this tank here for my kitchen. And the reason that that's so important, and why I prioritize pressurizing this tank over filling the DI tank, is because my ice maker would leak when the pressure would get too low. So my ice maker has a minimum pressure of 36 psi. With this setup, as soon as the pressure on this system, on this, basically when this switch is triggered, it's going to, you know, put water to this side of the system over trying to fill the big tank. And before I had all this pressure switch here, I didn't even have a way to just fill this part of the system. So essentially, if it wasn't detecting it purely based off a single pressure switch, which was over by the filter, then it just wasn't getting pressurized. So that's why I was having these issues with the freezer and ice maker leaking. Ever since I did this, it's been perfect. So I've got another DI meter here. So this is, if you haven't seen my previous video, the way that this works is it runs through this while it fills the tank, and then when water exits the tank, it goes through it again using a series of check valves and this and that. So these are actually SpectraPure cartridges, and the design of this is copied off of the SpectraPure coffee maker system. I sort of just implemented the same thing, but just on my own. So it is a ridiculous amount of check valves and T's and Y's and TDS meters and just a little bit of everything in there. But yeah, so that's another reason that I have that other pressure gauge that I put over there, because this gauge shows you the pressure of the booster tank. But then if you go over here, this gauge is basically this kind of the pressure from around where the pump is. And so right now it actually matches the booster tank because it was just filling the booster tank. I'm about to feed the fish. So I was upstairs using some RO and some of my Instant Hot. I have an Instant Hot off of the system as well. So I have instant like boiling water, and I use that to melt fish food. You know, I'll melt the frozen cubes. So when I was doing that, I lowered the pressure in the tank over there, and that caused it to fill up. Now, mind you, if I open the solenoid to fill the DI tank, the pressure won't be as high on that because it's just, there's no booster tank or anything. It's just kind of a free flow. So when it's filling that, you'll see the pressure gauge is bouncing off of like 0 to like 5. Not as much pressure when there's basically just pushing against the DI membrane. And I guess lastly, I didn't talk about the DI membrane. I now have dual DI. This is the SpectraPure Max Cap system in here. It's a BRS unit running SpectraPure media. That's just how I roll. This is the Max Cap, and then this is the Silica Buster. And then there's a TDS gauge here as well, which shows me after this and after this. And right now they should both be 0, I think. Yeah, 0, 0. So yeah, essentially it prioritizes filling the tank up in the ceiling over there before it fills this big guy. And if for some reason, say the pressure drops in the ceiling air, booster tank, it will close the solenoid here, which is the one on the floor, and then prioritize filling that. And then if this is lower, as in below the second bottom float switch, then it will start just filling this again once it's done with the other tank. However, if for some reason it's filled in between the two float switches, then it's just going to stop, and it'll wait until I use more water from this tank before it starts filling again. What else did I do? Everything's hardwired now. So you see this blue wire here, this is actually a network cable, and that goes over here to my my network switch. This is just part of some of my home networking, this and that. I've got a little bit of 10 gig fiber. I've got various Ethernet, power over Ethernet, you name it. So yeah, there's a lot of cables going over there now. And on top of that, the Apex Junior that is on here used to actually be on the not mixing station, the I guess quarantine tanks here. So these quarantine tanks have now an Apex Lite, which you can see the head unit is here. And I also upgraded, since I have to get rid of the power bar that's built into the Junior. There's now two EB8s, one here and then one here. And then on top of that, there's an EB4 down here, which does all the auto top off for the saltwater tanks, which is these 3 tanks. And they all top off from that same 10-gallon tank over there. And so these are my quarantine tanks. I've got a cool quarantine. I've got, this is a salt water quarantine. Right now I've got a pink face wrasse in there, or they've called it a 5-stripe wrasse. They call it so many names. The wrasse have many names. I still have my friend's Roa modesta, which is a Japanese butterfly, somewhat rare. Not super expensive, but pretty cool fish, very personable. And then up here is a freshwater quarantine, which has turned into a Russian doll cichlid breeding tank by accident. This is another freshwater quarantine that's running low on water. That's usually where I put my smaller, less aggressive freshwater fish. And ultimately I'd like to get these damn cichlids out of here into my big cichlid tank. But that's for another day. It's actually time to feed these tanks now, so I think I'm going to call at the end of the video. And so until next time.